Okay.
As a child, I was always told to say no to drugs. My teacher used to always tell me the same familiar story, every teacher I had. They said that one day, probably when I'm a teenager, I'd be walking down the street and I'd see some sketchy looking guy, probably with shoulder length hair, maybe some tattoos, and he'd come up to me and say in his sketchy guy voice, "Hey man, do you want to try some drugs?" Now, I've been alive for more than 20 years, and I realize that this story is preposterous because strangers just aren't that generous with their drugs. But there is a valuable lesson here. We shouldn't do illicit drugs because they're quite harmful, and drug usage is a very bad problem in our society. However, the problems caused by drug prohibition are actually much, much worse. That is why, while I personally say no to drugs, I say yes to legalization, and I hope that, once I'm finished, you all will as well. I will argue three things here. First, I will argue that prohibition has had a horrible effect on crime. Second, I will argue that it has been almost totally ineffective. And third, I will argue that it is a violation of our individual liberty. Let's start with crime. I'm sure you will all be shocked to hear that our government directly enables and subsidizes violent cartels responsible for killing thousands of Central Americans every single year. But that's exactly the case. What happens when something is relegated to the black market, as drugs are, is only gangs have access to selling those drugs. Now, they're able to make a lot of money off of this. Our Justice Department estimates that Mexican cartels make anywhere from $18 to $39 billion every single year off of selling drugs to the United States. Now, what our government would like to do is to totally eliminate this supply, but that's next to impossible. The best they can do is to decrease the supply. They decrease the supply, which raises the price of drugs, and hopefully decreases the quantity demanded. But as you economics students might know, the demand for drugs is inelastic, which means that the price will go up by a lot, but the quantity demanded will only go down by a little. And that increase in price means more profits for the drug cartel. They can then use these profits to create havoc, and it's no surprise that many of the countries they operate in are essentially failed states. In addition, 7 out of the 8 most murderous countries in the world happen to lie on the transportation route between where the cocaine is made in the Andes and where it is sold in the United States. What's more, Patrick Hugh of the New York Times said that 50,000 Mexicans have died due to drug cartel violence in the past 6 years, and this violence is particularly brutal. The cartels are so powerful in this country that when they murder someone, they don't have to worry about hiding it. Instead, they display the dismembered bodies of their victims in the streets during broad daylight like some sort of hellacious work of art. They don't just kill, they torture and they mutilate anyone who stands in their way, even children. Now in Mexico, this should inspire fear, and rightly so. But for us as Americans, it should inspire nothing but shame, because it is our drug use that is funding these cartels, and it is our policy of prohibition that is enabling them to exist and is making them rich. But this violence isn't just happening in Mexico, it's happening here too. It's the reason that, according to the Justice Department, 25% of US murders are due to drug-related violence, and it's destroying many inner-city neighborhoods. That's not even mentioning the racial profiling. Did you know that even though a white person and a black person are just as likely to use marijuana, a black person is 4 times as likely to go to jail for it? It's a leading cause of the rift between the black community and the police. It's also a totally ineffective policy. According to the Cato Institute, we now spend $40 billion every year trying to prohibit drugs. We've spent more and more every year since 1970. But guess what? The addiction rate in this country has stayed relatively stable at about 1.5% through all that time. That's a lot of money to spend on relatively no effect. And by the way, as the New York Times reported in 2007, we let 40% of murders go unsolved in this country every single year. And meanwhile, we're spending all of this money on stopping people from using drugs. And that makes me sick. The reality is this is a battle we cannot win. Contrary to popular belief, the most addictive drug in the world is not crack cocaine, it's not heroin, and it's not methamphetamine. It's money. When there's a demand for a product, someone is going to step up and supply. And when that happens, the product is prohibited, the people who supply it are unsavory characters like the cartels and like the gangs. The gangs will do anything to get these drugs over the border. The cartels have literally built catapults to fling the drugs over fences and mile-long tunnels to crawl under the border so that they can supply these drugs. Even if we were able to build some sort of iron dome to keep them out, people here would still invent synthetic drugs so that they could continue to get high. This war on drugs is futile and it is too costly, and we should surrender. Then there's the matter of individual liberty. As John Stuart Mill wrote, over himself, over his own mind and body, the individual is sovereign. If you don't have control over what you do with your mind and body, are you really a free person? Ask yourself that. The true role of government ought to be to stop people from harming other people, not to stop consenting adults from knowingly harming themselves. Although the evidence is shaky, people will insist that drugs make people more likely to be violent. But we need to remember that we don't arrest someone for a DUI every time they take a drink, and we don't arrest someone for murder every time they buy a gun. That's because we need to punish people based on the violence they commit, not based on the violence we fear that they may one day commit, because that makes no sense. Others will say that the government should act as a kind of parent figure for us. But we have to remember that the government already allows so many things that my mom personally would never let me do, like drinking, smoking, eating at McDonald's. The government allows these things because consenting adults knowingly do them, and it's not the government's place to say they shouldn't. In fact, even if they did say that, people would probably do them anyway. So what's my plan? I believe we need to incrementally legalize drugs nationwide, starting with marijuana and gradually moving to harder and harder drugs. Through this, we can put the drug gangs out of business because it is reasonable to assume that legal producers would be able to produce the drugs just as cheaply, if not more cheaply, than the cartels. In addition, we can tax these drugs, because as long as the price of a legal drug plus the taxes on it is less than the price of an illegal drug plus the huge implicit risk of buying a drug illegally, all rational buyers will choose the legal option. We can then use this money to protect minors from using drugs and to treat addiction, which is what our focus should have been all along. According to Jeffrey Myron, an economist at Harvard, our government could gain $85 billion every year off of legalization and taxation. And that's not even counting the $40 billion our healthcare system could save, because less people will be getting shot due to drive-bys and things like that related to drug violence. I propose that we allocate $4 billion every year to the FDA for regulation and an additional $20 billion to the state healthcare systems so that we can begin to solve this problem of drug addiction. In conclusion, many of you will still say that legal drugs makes you too uncomfortable, but we need to remember that that comfort is being paid for with the blood of thousands of innocent people every single year, not to mention billions of dollars. So, say no to drugs. Please say no to drugs, but say yes to legalization. Thank you.